One of the curious features of big history is that agrarian civilizations seem to arrive so late. I've had colleagues who've been shocked at how late they arrive in my big history course. We're now up to lecture 30, and finally we get to agrarian civilizations. But I do hope that you're getting a sense of how the much wider perspective of big history can help put very familiar subjects in new contexts. What we're really seeing is how the familiar topics of history, and particularly of world history, are not just givens. The big history perspective forces us to see that very clearly. They too had a history, and the history had a history, and the history had a history, and so on. So what we're really doing is setting them in a context consisting of all these multiple scales that we deal with in big history. Now, in a sense, in a minor way, that's what we've been doing in the last few lectures. Now we look at the appearance of the first agrarian civilizations. And we focus on southern Mesopotamia, where the process has been studied with peculiar thoroughness, which means that we can see the process probably more clearly than anywhere else in the world. So, how did the build-up of human and material resources that I described in the last lecture generate the first tribute-taking states, the first agrarian civilizations, and the first real cities? All of these developments occurred with surprising suddenness just before 3000 BCE, in the last few centuries before the turn of the millennium, in Sumer, at the southern edge of Mesopotamia. Now, I'm afraid here we have one more threshold. Many components are suddenly arranged into something new. This is something that happens each time we get a new level of complexity. The first cities, the first tribute-taking states, and the first agrarian civilizations. Now, we're going to focus on Sumer for the present, but we'll look at other areas in the next lecture. So, back to Sumer, although there's just one more bit of business I must deal with before we actually go to Sumer. And that concerns chronology and the labels we use for chronology. So far, it's usually been enough if I give a date to describe dates as before the present. And I've used the archaeologists' terminology of BP, before present. We saw that this is how radiometric dates are conventionally given. Technically it means before 1950, but that's not going to worry us most of the time. There's a sort of intuitive logic to such dates, but once we get into an era where we have documents, it makes much more sense to start using a more familiar way of dating events. And that is the convention that used to use the terminology of BC and AD. Now, of course, that comes ultimately from the Christian calendar. BC means before Christ, AD means Anno Domini, or Year of the Lord. And what I'm going to use is a slightly modified terminology, BCE or CE. BCE means before the Common Era. CE means in the Common Era. The system is essentially identical, of course, to the older system. The only reason for using it, and I'm not making a very strong argument for this, is that it's become the convention in writing on world history, and it is just slightly less tightly tied to the traditions of a particular culture, European Christian culture. So that's the terminology I'm going to use from now on. Dates BCE and CE. And just remember the simple rule. To convert from dates BP into the system we'll use from now on, you deduct 2,000 years. So 4,000 BCE is 6,000 BP. Okay? That's more or less where we're going to start. So let's now imagine ourselves transported to Sumer, southern Mesopotamia, near the Persian Gulf, about 6,000 years ago. So we're in Sumer 6,000 years ago. In 4,000 BCE, remember. Sumer, before this period, was a swampy region. It was a delta region. It was the delta of the Tigris and Euphrates. Andrew Sherratt described it as a backwater, as just an area of mud. People, he writes, did live there in grass huts and using clay sickles, but it was not the most lively spot on earth. However, that would begin to change from about 4000 BCE. And the fact that trade networks passed through the region may have been a crucial part of it. As Andrew Sherratt has argued, the fact that there were abundant trades far to the north and probably in lands to the south meant this was a region that traders passed through. That may have encouraged the growth of communities in this region. And so did another thing, the fact that beneath those swamps there were very rich soils. And eventually the region started to dry out. So climate change plays a crucial role in the story. And as the swamplands of southern Sumer begin to dry out, this turns into a region that can potentially support large numbers of people, and it begins to attract immigrants. So during the next 1,000 years, from 4000 to 3000 BCE, and again that's from 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, climates became drier. This made it easier to farm the land as swamplands began to dry out. But eventually, when the drying process went too far, it began to force more and more people to settle in the region's rapidly growing towns, as region after region became not just dry, but positively arid. And so gradually you find that people are forced into towns that control scarce water supplies and irrigation systems. Now, the other thing that may have forced them into towns may have been conflict over resources as the land dried. So what the drying did was first attract a lot of immigrants to the south, and then force more and more of them into towns that controlled water supplies. So what the archaeologists see in Sumer between 4000 BCE and 3000 BCE is a very rapid build-up of population. And then, quite suddenly, these populations seem to move out of villages and into a series of towns. Then, 10 to 20 powerful cities appear, quite quickly, late in the 4th millennium, in the centuries before 3000 BCE. They include Ur, Abraham's home city, according to biblical tradition. They include Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and Eridu. Most of these towns, we can still identify them. There are still some remains that can be excavated today. By 3000 BCE, the city of Uruk may have had 20 to 50,000 inhabitants. Now, by modern standards, 20 to 50,000 inhabitants is not a particularly impressive town. It's a sort of medium-sized, small to medium-sized town. But remember the context. In 3000 BCE, a town of 20 to 50,000 inhabitants had to count as one of the densest, largest communities that had ever existed in human history. And probably Uruk, or maybe one of its rival cities, were almost certainly the largest communities on Earth at the time. How did people live in Uruk? They lived in whitewashed mud brick houses along narrow streets. At the center of Uruk, on a huge artificial mound 12 meters high, which must have taken a lot of labor to build, stood the so-called White Temple. This was dedicated to the goddess Inanna, a goddess of both love and war. She has some interesting similarities to the Egyptian goddess Isis and the Hindu goddess Kali. And it's always tempting in these situations to think there may have been some cultural diffusion between these different regions. Inanna is also associated with the planet Venus. Around the main part of the city, there was a massive wall, sometimes more than 7 meters tall. The Epic of Gilgamesh is probably the world's oldest recorded epic, and what it describes is the epic adventures of a king of Uruk who probably, if he really existed, reigned from about 2750 BCE. It was the versions we have today were written down only in 1200 BCE, but it still may capture something of the city's appearance in the reign of King Gilgamesh. This is early in the 3rd millennium BCE. I have to say, actually I have to take a moment just to say, we've, in this course, we've had to work from indirect evidence so long that it's really fun to be able to use documentary descriptions at last. So, here we go. Now at last, written sources give us the sort of sharp focus that historians are used to. And we can begin to actually name people and name places, and we can actually begin to sort of think our way into an entire world. Well, here's here's the description from Gilgamesh of the city. Gilgamesh had restored the holy Eanna temple and the massive wall of Uruk, which no city on earth can equal. See how its ramparts gleam like copper in the sun. Climb the stone staircase, more ancient than the mind can imagine. Approach the temple of Inanna, sacred to Ishtar, that's another name to Inanna, a temple that no king has equalled in size or beauty. Walk on the wall of Uruk, says the poem. Follow its course around the city, inspect its mighty foundations, examine its brickwork, how masterfully it is built. Observe the land it encloses, the palm trees, the gardens, the orchards, the glorious palaces and temples, the shops and marketplaces, the houses, the public squares. This is one of the oldest literary texts we have, and I hope you'll agree, it at least creates the illusion of quite a vivid picture of a place. The modern description is a description in general of a number of Sumerian cities, and it comes from the writing of an archaeologist, Susan Pollock. Now, she has a long description of these cities, and I'm going to just cherry-pick some of the nicer parts. She writes, the area inside a city's wall was densely built up, but not in a uniform manner. She gives a wonderful sense of the sort of chaos of some of these early cities. There's only occasional evidence in Sumer for systematic city planning, and most areas of cities probably grew organically, in other words, ad hoc, higgledy-piggledy. Streets varied from narrow lanes to broader routes 2 to 3 meters wide, and served not only as passageways but also as convenient places in which to dump garbage. Abandoned buildings were used as receptacles for garbage disposal, along with cleared areas where no buildings stood. In general, we're going to see this over and over again. Early cities, the problem of waste disposal was very rarely handled well. She writes that large quantities of waste material were discarded at the edge of the city, perhaps in an attempt to organize refuse disposal. Open space, occupied houses as well as abandoned ones, and garbage dumps were also used sometimes, and this actually to a modern ear is quite shocking, as places to dispose of the dead, sometimes casually and sometimes in formal burials. Her description goes on to describe how these cities, to some extent, had a slightly rural feel in them. For example, you could find small livestock. You could find some pigs. You could find gardens. She also gives a nice description of the sort of vibrant, noisy quality of these cities. The dense architecture, narrow lanes, and wide range of activities and diverse population must have made these cities vibrant, noisy, smelly, sometimes bewildering and dangerous, but also exciting places. Houses, now she goes on to describe the architecture, were usually constructed abutting one another. Over time, as the composition and fortunes of a family changed, walls might be knocked down or erected, doors blocked or created, additions constructed or portions sold. In many ways, the houses she describes also could be recognized today. She writes, many of them had flat roofs with access to them by staircase or ladder. Just as today in the Near East, inhabitants of ancient Mesopotamian communities may have used roofs for a variety of activities, including sleeping in summer, drying items, and other tasks that required a large layout space. And one more detail that actually strikes a very modern ring. Around the edge of these cities, archaeologists have found evidence of sort of shanty towns, as immigrants from the countryside tried to make a living, often without great success, in the big cities. So I hope that gives you some sort of feeling for the quality of life in these early cities. Now we even have a map, by the way, of one of these cities, Nippur. The map dates from about 1500, but it is the first street map we have in world history. It shows the city's walls, its gardens, its canals, as well as a large temple complex. Now, these early cities that appear quite suddenly in Sumer were the densest and most complex communities that had ever existed. Uruk's 20 to 50,000 people lived in just 2.5 square kilometers. That's an area that would have supported, it could barely have supported a single individual using the foraging technologies of the Paleolithic era. So this is an astonishingly dense congregation of people. Unlike the foraging communities or the villages of the early agrarian era, these dense communities are not self-sufficient. Cities have never been self-sufficient. They couldn't support themselves. Many of their inhabitants were simply not farmers. They depended on, for getting food and other resources, on relations of control and exchange with nearby peasants. So, though some of the population could have been farmers travelling outside the city during the day to farm their lands, for the most part, these cities had to control nearby hinterlands. So a city, almost by definition, is a seat of power. And what this meant was forcing the peasants of nearby villages to supply them with goods, sometimes in return for a degree of protection or help with the maintenance of irrigation systems, often simply by force. These cities also traded along Mesopotamia's great rivers and across the seas, partly because this was indeed an arid land by now, and many resources, including stone, were in quite short supply, and wood. Now, I've talked a lot about complexity and emergent properties, so let's try and look at some of the emergent properties that appeared quite quickly as the first agrarian civilizations evolved. First cities and institutionalized power. The inhabitants of the first cities had many needs that could only be met by appointing powerful rulers. So these places were seats of power. And that's why I've argued they include some of the first tribute-taking states ever to appear. They're also sites of specialization and a division of labor. Now, specialization and a division of labor, these count as emergent properties of agrarian civilizations. What I mean by this is that in the village communities of the early agrarian era, basically everyone did the same thing. Everyone, more or less, with very minor exceptions, was a farmer. And probably in the villages of Mesopotamia this continued to be true. In cities, it's no longer true. Many city dwellers are specialists. They don't grow food. They're dependent on markets for essential supplies, and therefore they need to be in an environment where states can police and organize markets. There's a document from Sumer from about 2500 BC called the Standard Professions List. It mentions many different professions, including, and I just list some of them, soldiers, farmers, priests, gardeners, cooks, scribes, bakers, coppersmiths, jewelers, even snake charmers, and even the profession of king. Now, markets were vital also because Sumer, as we've seen, lacked basic materials such as wood. So rulers supported merchants who traded within what we'll call a world system. This is a terminology we'll use more later on. That is a large area of several interlinked agrarian civilizations between which there was a lot of trade. And this world system reached to Egypt, to North India, to Central Asia, and to Anatolia. We can tell this because we find in the archaeology of all of these regions goods that come from Sumer. Another emergent property, warfare linked with power. Cities needed defensive walls and irrigation systems. These could be built and maintained only by powerful rulers who could organize huge labor levies. Rulers controlled labor to some extent probably through slavery, fairly coercive forms of control, or corvée, in other words, obligations imposed on free people to occasionally supply labor instead of resources as tributes. Forced labour was important in all early agrarian civilizations for a very simple ecological reason. In societies without modern energy supplies, human beings themselves are the most exploitable sources of energy, apart from domesticated cattle. Humans were, from the point of view of rulers, living batteries. That incidentally explains why throughout the era of agrarian civilizations, slavery was such a powerful institution. If you keep slaves, you have supplies of living energy. And they also happen to be reasonably intelligent as well. So, humans were stores of usable energy for warfare, excavation, building, ditch digging, and so on. In several of the cities of Sumer, archaeologists have found mass-produced, very basic beveled rim bowls. And these were interpreted as evidence that the government was providing rations for huge levies of workers or slaves. Now, in these cities, another emergent property, we can describe it as, we find more organized forms of religion very closely linked to institutionalized forms of power. To maintain the favor of the gods, particularly if you want to maintain the favor of very powerful gods that can look after not just an individual person or household, but an entire city, it was necessary to build and supply temples, such as the Eanna temple at Uruk, which was dedicated to Inanna. Indeed, in many of these Sumerian cities, there are powerful hints that the first real rulers, late in the 4th millennium, may actually have been priests of some kind. It's certainly striking that the first very large buildings we find in them tend to be temples rather than palaces. One more emergent property. Bureaucracies, tributes, hierarchies, writing and armies. Actually, these all sort of tend to go together. Rulers ruled through literate bureaucracies, powerful taxation systems, and paid armies. These are features that would reappear in all tribute-taking states. Tributes. Let's look at tributes first. Just as farmers extracted what we can think of as ecological rents from their domesticated crops and animals, by which I mean that in return for protection, they take a part of each crop or each herd, in return for helping the crop or herd to reproduce next year. In the same way, rulers of Sumer's city-states collected resources from their subjects. And we call these tributes because, like modern taxes, they were raised at least in part through the threat of coercion. And we find hierarchies and classes. New hierarchies emerge with the wealthy and powerful at the top, and slaves and war captives at the bottom. Here is William McNeill's description of Sumer's class system. We've met William McNeill before. He is one of the doyens of modern world history. And in a recent world history that he wrote with his son, John McNeill, he writes, Sumerian cities comprised 3 distinct elements. A group of privileged citizens farmed irrigated land nearby and headed substantial households comprising relatives, a staff of dependent field workers, and a few imported slaves. Outside the walls, on the riverbank, a harbour community accommodated merchants, caravan personnel, traders, and sailors who came and went, bringing necessary imports to the city like timber, metals, and other precious materials, while exporting woolen textiles, date wine, and other manufactures in exchange. The most distinctive element of Sumerian cities, however, he writes, was the presence of one or more divine households or temples. These households were much larger than private ones, but the distribution of duties and income among members conformed in essentials to the way tasks and rewards were arranged within private households. And in Uruk, he'd have been referring to the Eanna temple of Inanna. Another crucial emergent property is bureaucracies and writing, the writing on which they were founded. How did writing emerge? It seems to have emerged we'll see this in all agrarian civilizations, it seems to have emerged out of accounting. So this is what seems to be the logic for the emergence of writing and to explain, and this seems to be the explanation for the odd fact that writing appears with agrarian civilizations. We've seen a sudden build-up of populations and a sudden build-up of resources. So suddenly we have rulers who control large amounts of resources, large amounts of people, but also large warehouses full of stuff, full of grain, full of precious metals that are being traded, full of stored tributes of various kinds. Now, if they've got these large amounts of stuff, we can call them treasuries in a later terminology, they clearly needed some method of keeping track of this stuff. If you have only a small amount of stuff, you don't need to keep track of it. But if you're really building up large amounts, you need to keep track of it. So suddenly, rulers need accounting. And it's these accounting methods that eventually evolve into the first writing systems. Now, how it did so varied from civilization to civilization, but this is what happened in Sumer. At first, it seems accounts were kept using tokens that sort of represented objects. Now, this could be a bit cumbersome. You could actually have to accumulate a lot of these tokens to represent a lot of objects. Then it became common to cut marks in clay using wedge-shaped papyrus stalks to represent objects such as sheep or units of grain. And very often you can do sort of little cartoon-like drawings to do this. Now, that's accounting, and it's quite easy to see how you can develop quite a useful accounting system in this way, but how do you move from accounting systems to a written language that can convey, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh? The crucial step here seems to be what's known as the rebus principle. Here's an illustration of how it worked. The Sumerian symbol for an arrow, the cuneiform incidentally means wedge-shaped. If you look at cuneiform writing, you'll find that these sliced papyri produce wedge-shaped marks in clay. So the Sumerian symbol for an arrow in cuneiform looked, of course, like an arrow. This is easy enough to imagine. But as it happened, the word for life, which is an abstract concept, which is it's hard to know how you could represent it in cuneiform or in a diagram, the word for life happened to sound almost exactly like the word for arrow. And the word sounded something like T. Now, what this meant was that the symbol for an arrow could be used for the more abstract idea of life. And this seems to be the crucial move to take you from what begins as an accounting system to a written language that can be used as richly or almost as richly as spoken language. By early in the third millennium, such changes meant that writing could record chronicles and even poetry. And because now, finally, for the first time in human history, we have poetry, I can't resist citing an example of an early Sumerian lullaby. These sort of documents suddenly allow us to feel that we're really getting into the world and psyche of humans who lived many millennia ago. Now, don't correct my Sumerian pronunciation. I'm just going to try and give you some feeling of how this goes. Usanganu, Usanganu, Usanganu ki dumungashe. Usakulu ki dumungashe. Ibadbadani ukunib. Now, that's just the first 4 lines. And it means something like this. Come sleep, come to my son. Hurry sleep to my son, put to sleep his restless eyes. I think it's wonderful the way that writing and documents can take us into a world in a way we've not been able to do before. Okay, let's move on. More emergent properties. Armies. With such huge resources, rulers could hire paid enforcers or armies. This is the crucial step from power from below to power from above. Much early Sumerian writing describes wars fought by well-organized armies, and a wonderful Sumerian mosaic of 2600 BCE, which is known as the Standard of Ur, depicts the army of Ur with its donkey-drawn chariots and large convoys of captives. It's really worth looking at. And another crucial emergent property is monumental architecture. Huge buildings or structures that are designed to impress your enemies but also to impress your subjects. They're one of the keys to statehood. The royal tombs of Ur from the late 4th millennium show the spectacular riches that rulers could accumulate and the extraordinary expense lavished on the creation of awe-inspiring tombs. As in the royal burials of many agrarian civilizations, servants and relatives of the king were often killed and buried to serve the king in afterlife. And from late in the 3rd millennium BCE, the typical form of monumental architecture in Mesopotamia would become the ziggurat, a stepped, pyramid-like temple dedicated to the gods, of which the best preserved today is that of Ur. The Tower of Babel has often been interpreted as a reference to the ziggurat of Babylon, which was dedicated to the god Marduk, and the Babylonian word Babili meant gate of God. Now, two more significant things occur about 1,000 years after the appearance of the first states, and I'll describe these just very briefly. The first is the appearance, late in the 3rd millennium, under a ruler called Sargon, of the first multi-city state, the first imperial state in the region. And it's based on a city called Akkad in northern Sumeria. We actually have busts of Sargon. This is one of the first great rulers whose names we know. And finally, there's another crucial development that would recur in many agrarian civilizations, and I'll call this ecological overreach. The cities of Sumer frequently experience catastrophic floods, and these are the basis of the stories of biblical floods. But there was an even greater danger. In around 2000 BCE, there's a massive crash of populations in Sumer, and eventually it destroys Sumerian civilization, and civilization will drift north in Mesopotamia. The fundamental cause seems to have been over-irrigation that led to an increase in salts of various kinds in the soils and reduced the fertility of the soils, sharply reducing productivity of agriculture, leading to a sharp decline in production and eventually undermining Sumerian civilization. This was a sign that these wonderful, complex structures that appeared were also extremely fragile, and we see this is true of most agrarian civilizations. So, voila! A whole series of linked features have come together to establish the first agrarian civilizations with all their complexity and also their fragility. Thank you. Occurred with surprising suddenness just before 3000 BCE, in the last few centuries before the turn of the millennium, in Sumer, at the southern edge of Mesopotamia. Now, I'm afraid here we have one more threshold. Many components are suddenly arranged into something new. This is something that happens each time we get a new level of complexity. The first cities, the first tribute-taking states, and the first agrarian civilizations. Now, we're going to focus on Sumer for the present, but we'll look at other areas in the next lecture. So, back to Sumer, although there's just one more bit of business I must deal with before we actually go to Sumer. And that concerns chronology and the labels we use for chronology. So far, it's usually been enough if I give a date to describe One of the curious features of big history is that agrarian civilizations seem to arrive so late. I've had colleagues who've been shocked at how late they arrive in my big history course. We're now up to lecture 30, and finally we get to agrarian civilizations. But I do hope that you're getting a sense of how the much wider perspective of big history can help put very familiar subjects in new contexts. What we're really seeing is how the familiar topics of history, and particularly of world history, are not just givens. The big history perspective dates as before the present. And I've used the archaeologists' terminology of BP, before present. We saw that this is how radiometric dates are conventionally given. Technically it means before 1950, but that's not going to worry us most of the time. There's a sort of intuitive logic to such dates. But once we get into an era where we have documents, it makes much more sense to start using a more familiar way of dating events. And that is the convention that used to use the terminology of BC and AD. Now, of course, that comes ultimately from the Christian calendar. BC means before Christ, AD means Anno Domini, or Year of the Lord. And what I'm going to use is a slightly modified terminology. BC forces us to see that very clearly. They too had a history, and the history had a history, and the history had a history, and so on. So what we're really doing is setting them in a context consisting of all these multiple scales that we deal with in big history. Now, in a sense, in a minor way, that's what we've been doing in the last few lectures. Now we look at the appearance of the first agrarian civilizations. And we focus on southern Mesopotamia, where the process has been studied with peculiar thoroughness, which means that we can see the process probably more clearly than anywhere else in the world. So, how did the build-up of human and material resources that I described in the last lecture generate the first tribute-taking states, the first agrarian civilizations, and the first real cities? All of these developments are BCE or CE. BCE means before the Common Era. CE means in the Common Era. The system is essentially identical, of course, to the older system. The only reason for using it, and I'm not making a very strong argument for this, is that it's become the convention in writing on world history, and it is just slightly less tightly tied to the traditions of a particular culture, European Christian culture. So that's the terminology I'm going to use from now on. Dates BCE and CE. And just remember the simple rule. To convert from dates BP into the system we'll use from now on, you deduct 2,000 years. So 4,000 BCE is 6,000 BP.